We have to honestly and aggressively attack the universities in this country. Ladies and gentlemen, the universities do not pursue knowledge and truth. They pursue deceit and lies, and it's time to be honest about that fact. And we subsidize, we support, and in our own ways, all of us reinforce the power of universities to control our lives and control how we live them. So much of what drives truth and knowledge as we understand it in this country is fundamentally determined by, supported by, and reinforced by the universities in this country. The simple fact is that our universities tell the powerful what they want to hear, and they couch it in ridiculous political rhetoric instead of dealing with the real consequences of progressive policy.
Well, hello everyone and welcome back. My name is Michael Granado. I'm a history and philosophy educator, and I decided to make this video kind of as a follow-up with the recent video that I made called The Death of the Expert, The Death of Expertise. Now I can't remember my own video title. It's been a long week. I live in Georgia, Savannah, Georgia, and I'm just got my power back on Sunday. As many of you are probably aware of, we just got hit by a major hurricane. So my sense of time is a little distorted. But I just made that video about expertise. And then on Tuesday, I believe it was, I watched the vice presidential debate, and this notion of expertise was actually brought up. And what kind of prompted this video was not just that the notion of expertise was brought up by Vance and by Waltz. Waltz brought up the notion of, I think it was economic expertise within the context of economics. And the pushback that Vance gave was to kind of juxtapose, to compare and contrast this idea of expertise with this notion of common sense. Now, let me go ahead and start off this video by saying that I'm not delving into the economic policies of either vice presidential candidate. That's not the purpose of this video. Rather, the purpose of this video is to start off with, to kind of further explore this notion of expertise and to further explore the problems I think that a lot of people have with expertise, why they have these problems with expertise, and then to go into how this notion of common sense is used kind of as an objection to, a rebuttal of the idea of expertise, that we don't need expertise because we can rely upon common sense. Now, I played that clip at the beginning of this video because what I want to start off talking about is this fundamental distrust of expertise, this distrust of experts and of institutions that we're seeing enter in more and more so, I think, or at least from what I have observed, into common political talk, specifically political talk that has to do with where experts are weighing in on certain topics and politicians are building policies or objecting to policies based off of expert opinion. As I alluded to in the previous video, this sort of language and lingo is not something that's new within the context of American history and American politics. You see, there's kind of a thread of anti-intellectualism, anti-authoritarianism, that's a form of government, anti-authority with respect to institutions of knowledge and governance that has always kind of been a part beneath the surface throughout American history. So in some way, I'm sure that somebody could write a history book kind of chasing that progress and that lineage of anti-intellectualism throughout American history. I know it's been done. I have a book called The Death of the Evangelical Mind. Not the death of the, I'm confusing my own title, The Struggle of the Evangelical Mind, that talks about this within the context of evangelical Christianity and how evangelical Christianity has come to terms or tried to come to terms with intellectualism. So I'm sidetracking myself. I say all that to say that, yes, there's certainly a trend, a thread that runs throughout American history that I think we're seeing culminate in modern political discourse for sure. But what I'm interested in is more recently, within the past 20 to 30 years or so, where this fundamental mistrust of experts comes from. And now there's been some big public examples. I call this sort of conspiratorial thinking, and I know that kind of language throws a lot of people off, especially if they're kind of buying into this to be labeled like that. But there is good grounds for this in some historical cases. I have in mind, for example, what happened throughout the 80s and the 90s with respect to tobacco companies. In some cases, you had tobacco companies that were funding studies about tobacco and either downplaying and minimizing the negative health risk associated with smoking tobacco, specifically the correlation between tobacco and cancer. In the early 2000s, of course, within American history specifically, we have September 11th. And one of the things that's kind of the hallmark of conspiracy theories, you saw the same thing with JFK, where there was an official explanation that was provided. For a lot of people, that official explanation just didn't add up or explain the significance of the event. It's incredibly difficult for people to conceptualize and wrap their heads around the largest terrorist attack in US history. And so when the official explanation came for who did it and specifically for like why the buildings collapsed, a lot of people rejected that. And with that rejection came a fundamental distrust of the people who were offering that explanation. And this is, I think, really where that's rooted in. And after September 11th, a few other examples I can think of more recently would be like the opioid crisis. With the opioid crisis, you have experts within the context of pharmaceutical companies as well as individual doctors who, in many cases, didn't adequately describe the health risk associated with the use of opioids. And in a lot of cases, just kind of push these drugs onto people. In a lot of cases, they may not have even needed the opioids to treat the pain, but they were still given it because it was just kind of a something that they would push out. And with the opioid crisis, we have the distrust of experts coming in the form of this idea that the reason why the doctors are writing those prescriptions is because they're being given some sort of incentive. And this implies a sort of malevolence that I think lies at the heart of the fundamental mistrust of experts, an assumption of malevolence on the part of the experts that they're saying these things, that they're doing these things for a particular reason, and that reason is almost always a monetary reason, as it is the case with most things and most motivations that happen within the world. And because of situations like that, I think it's natural for people to make that leap, to make that jump, and say that it's not just limited to these specific cases, but we can apply this sort of rationale and reasoning to all cases and all cases of expertise. And this is something that was actually brought up in the comments section of the video I made by Snow03mo, Snowmo. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce these usernames. Snow, thank you for watching the video. Thank you for the comment. I appreciate the feedback and the interaction. But Snow says, good overview of what makes an expert and how to recognize one. Thank you again. Unfortunately, experts are not superheroes. They all have cognitive biases, a desire for social recognition, and a need to earn money. And Snow's absolutely right. Experts exist, typically speaking, experts exist within a system, within an organization. And usually when we're talking about experts, we're referring to use the examples that I've been using throughout this video, academic experts, and going back to the video that I just played about Vance, academic experts existing within the context of the university system. Academics are people just like any other people. They make mistakes, they have their biases, they have their prejudice that comes out in their works. And yes, in some cases, they are paid by outside organizations to do the research that they're doing. Now, I don't think this is the direction that Snow meant for the comment to be taken in, but I'm going to take it in this direction. Thanks again, Snow. I love to read y'all's comments, so please leave comments for these videos. But this is an idea that I think, from what I've heard and from what I've encountered, really drives the mistrust of expertise. And I've had this experience in person. I mean, I get this experience online all the time. A lot of people accuse me of things. It's funny that people assume that I'm being paid to say the things that I'm saying. I wish, please, by all means, give me some sort of sponsorship. I'm just kidding, or am I? But I've actually encountered this in person, and I was thinking about this. One, because of I'm making this video, but two, also because the context of what just happened with the hurricane. This was a number of years ago. I can't remember how long. It was quite a while. It's probably like upwards of 5, 6 years ago. There was a hurricane that was coming through Savannah. I mean, this happens every single year. I have to evacuate for a hurricane. But in this particular instance, my wife's a medical professional. She had to work the emergency shift at the hospital, and they're kind of on lockdown, so they're not like they can get visitors coming in and out. And plus, there was a evacuation order that was given by the governor, so I had to evacuate Savannah. So I wound up going up to North Georgia, where my wife's family's from, stayed with her cousin and her cousin's father, and we had some interesting conversations. They are both more right-leaning, politically speaking, but they're also both kind of deeply within the world of conspiracy theories. And this is sort of a natural conversation that happens with me a lot. You know, you start off with your pleasantries, you introduce each other. Hey, how are you doing? I'm good. So tell me a little bit about yourself. What do you do? Right? This is a question that gets asked. What do you do? What do you do for a living? And then I kind of just start off broadly, usually with these questions, and just say, oh, I'm a teacher, because when people find out that I teach history and that I teach philosophy, sometimes it gets weird, and I don't always want to have those weird conversations. And it got weird in this case. I told the guy's father, I teach history, I teach philosophy. He was focused on the history bit, and he, of course, wanted to tell me his opinions about history, specifically about, we had a conversation about the American Civil War. I'm sure you can imagine how that conversation went. It was not not a pleasant one, let's say. But towards the end of the conversation, he said a comment that stuck out to me. He said, well, of course you would say that. And so I was like, well, what do you mean? Of course I would say that. And the idea that he presented is kind of the idea that I've been talking about. He had this belief that I was being paid to kind of push liberal propaganda, that I was being paid to say certain things about the American Civil War over and against other things. And I was trying to parse this out a little bit with him. And the conversation didn't really go that far. But there is this idea that I was intentionally suppressing one aspect of history because I was being told to say another thing about, or being paid to say another thing about history. Now, part of that, this is where it gets difficult, because, and this is what I told him, like, well, part of that is true, because at the time I was teaching for a state technical college. And so, yes, I was being paid by the state of Georgia to teach specific things about U.S. history. There's a national curriculum that me as a teacher that I have to abide by. I can't just stand up there. Well, I could, but I'm not supposed to just stand up there and just say whatever the hell I want to about any part of history that I want to. There are certain topics that I have to cover, and the Civil War is one of those topics. If you take American History 1 and your teacher doesn't talk about the American Civil War, get your money back. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. So what I noticed about the conversation is that this use of, I want to say use of money, this assumption that I was being paid, and that I was being paid to say a specific thing about history for what was, I think, overtly political reasons, that I was being paid to present a particular view of history that was counter to, or that was kind of an objection to, the conservative view of history and the conservative position and assumptions about how the world operated. It was a strange conversation, but that was the gist of it. But what I've noticed about that is that because of that assumption, because of this idea that experts are pushing a particular agenda that they're being paid to push, that it leads to kind of what we can term like the politicalization of knowledge, that expert opinion is not expert opinion. It's just the opinion of people that are pushing a specific agenda. And this fundamentally undermines the notion of expertise, and it completely disregards how experts come to their opinion and how experts come to a consensus about a particular idea. And what I was trying to explain is that within the context of history, there are some things that historians reach a consensus about simply because there's just an overwhelming amount of evidence for that position. And the reason why you don't hear people taking alternative narratives or positing alternative narratives is because there's no evidence to suggest that that thing's the case. If you look, especially within the 20th century, an example like World War II, right? The fact that the nation of Japan attacked the United States December 7th, 1941, you're not going to hear a professional, well, I always say this. I'm sure that there's some professional historian out there somewhere, but odds are you're not going to hear an expert on World War II argue for the narrative that it was not the Japanese who attacked the United States, just because that would just be silly. There's so much evidence that we have to suggest that's the case. And within the context of history, that's typically speaking what we mean when we talk about a consensus is that the narrative itself about how we interpret and understand an event within context is not very controversial, meaning that there's not alternative explanations that may or may not carry equal weight. This is different depending upon the discipline, but this is usually when we talk about consensus and expert consensus, it's something that all the experts within the field agree upon. But once you introduce the false motive that a lot of conspiracy theories introduce to this, the kind of nefarious nature of expertise, experts as a cabal that get together, they know what true history is, but they decide that they're not going to teach true history because we want to corrupt the minds of the youth, so to speak. That's where one, you enter the realm of conspiracy theory, yes, but you've also completely undone the nature and the notion of expertise. And what I saw in the vice presidential debate was a rejection of expertise, and in its place, an introduction of this notion of common sense. So let me play a little clip from the vice presidential debate, then we'll talk about this idea of common sense.
Governor, you say trust the experts. But those same experts for 40 years said that if we shipped our manufacturing base off to China, we'd get cheaper goods. They lied about that. They said if we shipped our industrial base off to other countries, to Mexico and elsewhere, it would make the middle class stronger. They were wrong about that. They were wrong about the idea that if we made America less self-reliant, less productive in our own nation, that it would somehow make us better off, and they were wrong about it. And for the first time in a generation, Donald Trump had the wisdom and the courage to say to that bipartisan consensus, we're not doing it anymore. We're bringing American manufacturing back. We're unleashing American energy. We're going to make more of our own stuff. And this isn't just an economic issue. I mean, I've got 3 beautiful little kids at home, 7, 4, and 2, and I love them very much, and I hope they're in bed right now. But look, so many of the drugs, the pharmaceuticals that we put in the bodies of our children are manufactured by nations that hate us. This has to stop, and we're not going to stop it by listening to experts. We're going to stop it by listening to common sense wisdom, which is what Donald Trump governed on.
Senator, your time.
So again, the purpose of this is not to delve into or critique JD Vance's policies. I'm not a political expert. I don't have a background in political philosophy or political science. But what I thought was interesting is the way that Vance phrased this. I want to talk about this notion, not just of expertise, but also of common sense. So expertise is framed over and against this understanding of common sense. And I think this is problematic for several reasons. The first reason it's problematic is because these terms are being used in a very, very generalized sense, and it's not really specified what exactly we mean when we talk about either one. So we're using these very general terms, I think, to set up a sort of a straw man on Vance's part. And I often get this problem in my students' paper when they present like an argumentative paper, when they're arguing for one side of a philosophical issue, and they use the ominous they. You may have had a conversation with somebody and they use the they to set up their argument, right? They say this, these people do this, that person did that, they believe this. The problem with using generalizations like that is you're creating a completely false position. When you're responding to a particular argument, you want to respond to a particular person. Instead of saying what I tell my students, they say this. Who says that? Where do they say that? Use their exact words. You want to build their position and represent the position in the way that they represent their position. You don't want to create some false straw man position. That way, you're giving them a fair shot, and that way your argument looks stronger. So when you say the experts, who are we talking about? Now, I get that a vice presidential debate is not a place to go into detail and to cite your sources and to make sure that you're referencing the right. We saw an objection to that both in the presidential debate and in this debate. That's not what they're trying to do here. And again, I'm not talking about specifically within this context, just using it as an example. But who is the they? Who are these experts, and what exactly is their argument? Because when you get into subjects like climate change, which was brought up in the presidential debate, and you're disagreeing with the expert, well, then on what grounds are you standing? Which brings me to the second, probably the biggest problem with this, is that it's not clear exactly what we mean by common sense. Now, on the one hand, and I know this is going to sound weird, on the one hand, everybody has a common sense understanding of what common sense is. If you go up to the person on the street and you say, do you have common sense? Everybody's going to say yes. No one's going to be like, no, I don't have common sense. What is that? But once we start to analyze this concept more, again, it's not really clear what common sense means. And almost always in arguments like this, when somebody appeals to common sense, that appeal is done usually to justify their own position and the own argument that they're making. So typically speaking, when somebody says, well, I don't agree with this because of common sense, they're doing that in order to justify themselves, right? And saying that they understand this idea, this concept, because they have common sense. And by extension, you don't have common sense, which is why you don't understand this. So the notion of common sense is almost always self-serving, and it's not clear what the sort of standard is for common sense. Is common sense something that you're born with? Is it something that you gain over time? Is it something that you learn from the liberal teachers who are there to indoctrinate you? Sorry, just kidding. But where does it come from? What is its basis? Where do we learn it? Do we learn it? All of these questions are not very well articulated because the concept itself is not very well articulated. And finally, and here's the kicker, because if by common sense we mean our basic intuitive understanding of the world, what we know about the world and what we can know about the world through our like basic experiences, our basic unadulterated experiences, which is very problematic within the context of philosophy, but glossing over that, if you say like, okay, well, that's common sense, something similar or akin to like intuition. Well, within the part of philosophy that I study, the history and the philosophy of science, intuition in a lot of cases is just wrong. Our basic intuitive understanding of the world can be incredibly misleading. Just think about this within some basic examples within science. So forget everything you know for a second, as if that's possible. Forget everything you know for a second. Place yourself back in time, pre-Copernicus, pre-scientific revolution. If I were to ask you, is the Earth the center of the solar system? Or even a more basic question, do you think the Earth moves? Well, Aristotle and other ancient philosophers presented some very strong arguments based off of common sense that the Earth stands still. Based off of common sense, how could you argue that the Earth moves? Right? I don't feel the Earth moving. If I jump up in the air, I land in the same spot that I jumped up from. The Earth didn't move underneath my feet. Even if I jump up theoretically really high and come down and like break my legs or something, I'm landing in the same spot. The same with the movements of the stars and the movements of the planets. The star, the sun, the moon, the other stars in the night sky that move, the other planets that move, the stars don't move. At least they didn't see the stars move. The planets that we see move in the night sky appear as if they're moving around us, not us moving around them with respect to the sun. So a common sense understanding of the universe can be extremely misleading. And becomes even more problematic once we get into the 20th century, where Einstein fundamentally disrupts the common sense understanding of simultaneity, and Heisenberg fundamentally disrupts the common sense understanding of place. Common sense can be incredibly misleading, and common sense as a basis of knowledge, I'm not sure where to even begin with that. It's just kind of a really odd place that needs a lot of flushing out. So to say that I disagree with experts because of common sense, we're going to need a little bit more explanation. Anyway, I'll stop my ramblings for this video there. Once again, I would love to hear what you have to think about this, specifically how this idea of common sense is used within the context of political rhetoric. What stood out to you about the vice presidential debate? Again, I'm not here to debate policy with anybody. Not my place not my expertise, right? But I would be curious to see what you have to say about this idea of common sense, how Vance used common sense, and I will see you all next time. Have a good one.